In medieval European society, knights did not emerge by chance. They were shaped through a long process of training that began at a very young age. The sons of the nobility were often destined to become warriors from birth, as warfare and the defense of land were responsibilities bound to their lineage. Their childhood differed greatly from that of peasant children, as play was quickly replaced by discipline and physical training. Families viewed early training as essential preparation for a life tied to violence and obligation. From the moment they could walk, children were introduced to horseback riding, running, and basic physical exercises. The initial goal was not combat, but building physical strength and endurance. Discipline was taught alongside physical conditioning through absolute obedience and respect for family hierarchy. These children grew up in an environment that constantly emphasized honor duty and loyalty. As a result, childhood carried more responsibility than play, since their future had already been determined. Training aimed not only to create strong warriors, but also to shape a mindset of service to a lord. Every lesson was directed toward preparation for the battlefield and the harsh realities of military life. This upbringing created a wide gap between noble children and the rest of society. The path to knighthood began very early, even before the child could truly understand the meaning of the sword. From this foundation, the later stages of training became increasingly demanding. With their childhood thus shaped, the boy would move on to the role of a page, entering an even more rigorous environment. Around the age of 7, a noble boy would usually leave his family to live in the castle of another lord, beginning the stage of life as a page in order to learn discipline and the feudal order. Sending a child away at such an early age helped separate him from the protection of his family and placed him in a harsh environment where every action was closely supervised and judged. A page did not learn to fight immediately, but instead began by performing daily services within the castle, from cleaning the great hall to carrying food and caring for horses. Through service, the child learned his place within the hierarchy, clearly understanding who gave orders and who was expected to obey them. Repetitive tasks helped cultivate patience, attentiveness, and the ability to endure long hours of fatigue. Alongside this labor, pages received basic physical training, such as running, climbing, and simple horseback riding. These exercises were not meant to build strength immediately, but to create a resilient foundation for the harsher training stages that would follow. Children began to familiarize themselves with wooden weapons, learning how to grip them, maintain balance, and coordinate their movements through combat-like games. These games were not merely for entertainment, but served as tools to train reflexes, endurance, and a competitive spirit from an early age. Discipline was strictly enforced, with mistakes often punished in order to eliminate weakness and instill habits of obedience. Pages were also taught etiquette, how to greet superiors, serve at the table, and behave properly in the presence of those above them. Honor, loyalty, and obedience were constantly emphasized as the core values of a knightly life. This stage of being a page lasted many years, long enough to transform a child into someone accustomed to discipline and responsibility. From this foundation, the boy was finally considered worthy of advancing to true military training. From a life of service, the path toward becoming an armed attendant began to clearly take shape. Around the age of 14, a page advanced to the stage of squire, when training became clearly focused on combat and preparation for the life of a knight. At this stage, the adolescent still served a knight, but his responsibilities were heavier and directly tied to daily military life. A squire had to care for weapons, armor, and war horses, learning every component and how each was used in real combat. Through preparing equipment, he learned the importance of caution, since a small mistake could lead to death on the battlefield. Physical training became far more demanding, including long-distance riding, carrying heavy loads, and continuous combat practice. He learned to use the sword, shield, and lance beginning with basic movements before gradually progressing to sparring exercises. Training sessions often lasted many hours, meant to build endurance and the ability to withstand pain. Squires also accompanied their knights to battlefields or minor skirmishes, directly observing the realities of war. Through this, they learned how to remain calm in the face of violence, blood, and death lessons, impossible to master on a training ground alone. Discipline remained strict, as slowness or disobedience could result in severe punishment. Beyond combat skills, squires were taught to protect their lord's honor and uphold oaths of loyalty. They learned how to conduct themselves toward comrades, enemies, and civilians according to the emerging ideals of chivalry. This stage lasted many years and served as a harsh filter, weeding out those unable to endure its demands. Not everyone succeeded, as those with weak bodies or unsuitable temperament were gradually eliminated. It was through these severe trials that the image of the knightly warrior slowly took shape. From the rank of squire, only one step remained: the formal ceremony of knighthood itself. After many years of harsh training, a squire was only knighted once he had proven sufficient physical strength, combat skill, and absolute loyalty to his lord. The knighting ceremony was not conducted casually, but was usually chosen to coincide with a meaningful moment, such as a military achievement, the candidate's coming of age, or the military needs of the lord's domain. Before the day of knighthood, the candidate often underwent a strict period of preparation, including bathing, fasting, and prayer to symbolize spiritual purification. This preparation emphasized that a knight was not merely a warrior, but also a bearer of moral responsibility within feudal society. The ceremony typically took place in a chapel or great hall, witnessed by the lord clergy and other knights. The candidate knelt, placed his hand upon a weapon or a holy book, and swore loyalty, pledging to defend his lord and the community. The moment when the lord touched the kneeling man's shoulder with the sword was regarded as the official transition to a new social status. From that instant, the newly made knight assumed the rights and duties of knighthood, including fighting, defending territory, and upholding honor. The ceremony did not merely confer a title, but also open access to land spoils of war and elevated social standing. However, these privileges came with heavy responsibilities, as a knight was expected to be ready to sacrifice his life when summoned. Not every squire was knighted, as the ceremony also served as a final stage of selection. Those who failed to meet the requirements might continue serving or be removed from the path to knighthood altogether. The knighting ceremony thus marked a clear boundary between an apprentice and a true warrior. Its solemn ritual reinforced the feudal order and the legitimacy of the warrior elite. Through knighthood, medieval society affirmed the values of loyalty and honor. With this new title, the knight stepped into a life of real combat, filled with danger. After being knighted, a knight did not stop training, because the battlefield demanded practical combat abilities far beyond what could be learned in a castle courtyard. Training focused on riding while wearing heavy armor, maintaining balance, and controlling weapons. When the body's movement was severely restricted, knights practiced using swords, lances, and shields in realistic sparring sessions that simulated the chaos of real combat. These exercises were usually supervised by veteran knights who corrected mistakes that could otherwise prove fatal in battle. Beyond individual skill, knights learned to fight in formation, hold their position, and obey commands under extreme pressure. Training sessions often lasted many hours, building endurance for fighting while exhausted and hungry. Pain was not avoided in training, as hard impacts and minor injuries were considered inevitable. Knights learned to endure pain and continue fighting even when wounded, as long as the injury was not immediately life-threatening. Practice bouts also served as opportunities to demonstrate ability, shaping a knight's reputation and standing among fellow warriors. Actual battle differed greatly from training, as screams, blood, and corpses tested a knight's mental strength. Only those who could remain calm under such conditions were able to survive and fight effectively. Real combat experience quickly became the true measure of a knight's worth. Reputation was earned not through oaths but through survival and victory. Training, therefore, did not end with knighthood, but continued throughout a warrior's life. A knight was always preparing for the next campaign, where skill meant the difference between life and death. From the blood-soaked battlefield, it is necessary to look at how knights were taught honor and morality, the values that shaped the image of knighthood in medieval society. Alongside physical training, medieval knights were deeply educated in the concept of honor, which feudal society regarded as the foundation of order and loyalty. Honor was not merely personal reputation, but was bound to one's family lord and the oaths sworn before the community. From the time they were pages, children were taught that their misconduct could stain the honor of their entire lineage. Knights learned to keep their word, as breaking one's promise was considered a lasting blemish on a warrior's life. Loyalty to one's lord was placed above personal interests and even personal safety. Betrayal was regarded as a grave crime, often leading to loss of status or severe punishment. Knights were taught to protect those weaker than themselves whenever possible in order to preserve the moral image of the warrior class. However, this ideal frequently clashed with the brutal reality of war and uncompromising orders. Balancing personal honor with military duty became a profound mental challenge. Stories of exemplary knights were passed down as models for future generations. Moral education helped create behavioral norms, even though not everyone adhered to them fully. Honor became a tool of social control, compelling knights to act according to shared standards. This education contributed to maintaining the feudal order during a time marked by violence. Through honor and loyalty, knights were bound not only by the sword, but by spiritual obligation. These values followed a knight throughout his life, even after war had ended. From this moral framework, it is necessary to look at the darker side of knightly training. Not every lesson led to glory or justice. The process of training a knight did not only build physical strength, but was also saturated with violence and psychological pressure that lasted from childhood into adulthood. Noble children were exposed early to harsh punishment, where flogging and humiliation were used to correct behavior. Weakness was considered shameful, forcing many children to suppress fear and pain. Brutal training meant young bodies frequently suffered injuries, leaving lasting damage that could follow them throughout life. Many knights carried physical impairments from a very young age, yet were still required to continue training and service. The pressure to meet the expectations of family and lord created a heavy psychological burden. Failure in training was not seen as a personal shortcoming alone, but as a stain on the honor of the entire lineage. Fear of being cast aside drove many to endure far beyond their physical and mental limits. Violence in training was regarded as necessary, since the battlefield was believed to be far more brutal. However, not everyone could adapt to such an environment without psychological harm. Some knights became emotionally hardened, coming to see violence as a normal part of life. Others carried deep trauma, struggling to reintegrate when war was no longer constant. Knightly training thus produced highly effective warriors, but also left behind many invisible scars. Feudal society accepted this cost as inevitable in order to maintain military strength. Through this darker side, the image of the knight appears not only glorious, but deeply conflicted and marked by personal sacrifice. From the wounds inflicted during training, it is necessary to look at the everyday life of knights after reaching adulthood. It is in life beyond the battlefield that the long-term impact of their training truly becomes clear. After reaching adulthood, a knight did not exist solely on the battlefield, but lived a daily life deeply shaped by the training that had begun in childhood. Their lives were tied to castles, military camps, and estates where the responsibility to protect and govern was always present. Knights had to maintain daily physical training to preserve their strength, since neglect meant the risk of failure when combat arose. Caring for weapons, armor, and war horses was a constant duty, reflecting the discipline instilled since their days as pages. Even in times without war, knights took part in patrols, trained soldiers, and supervised the security of the Lord's lands. Daily life was highly militarized, governed by strict schedules and clear commands from the Lord. Meals, rest, and leisure were all shaped by duty, never as free or relaxed as the lives of common people. Training from an early age accustomed knights to placing responsibility above personal comfort. Their social relationships were also influenced by notions of honor and hierarchy learned in youth. Knights were expected to maintain a model image before soldiers and local inhabitants in order to preserve authority. Any misconduct could damage personal honor and weaken the power of the Lord they served. Everyday life thus remained demanding, becoming a quiet continuation of lifelong training. Knights rarely experienced complete rest, since war could come at any moment. Constant vigilance was the result of early education, centered on danger and obligation. Through daily life, it becomes clear that knightly training did not end with adulthood. From this routine existence, one must look next at the relationship between knights and the society around them. It was precisely their training that shaped their role and image within medieval communities. In medieval society, a knight was not only a warrior, but also a symbol of order, authority, and protection for the community living within a lord's domain. Common people viewed knights as a shield against raiding, conflict, and external threats. Their presence brought a sense of security, even though war and violence were always close at hand. Knights represented the power of the Lord, acting on his behalf to govern, collect taxes, and maintain order in the region. The way they behaved, whether just or brutal, directly affected the lives of ordinary people. A fair knight could strengthen the loyalty of the population, while a cruel one sowed fear and resentment. As a result, the image of the knight was not uniform, but depended on the lived experiences of each community. Stories passed down orally about brave or ruthless knights spread across generations. Storytelling culture helped shape both idealized and critical images of knighthood. During festivals and public ceremonies, knights appeared as embodiments of honor and strength. Their clothing, weapons, and war horses set them apart, reinforcing their elevated social status. Children looked up to knights as role models, while adults regarded them with both hope and caution. Their social role required knights to uphold a proper public image, even as their personal lives were filled with pressure. The tension between ideal and reality made knights both respected and mistrusted. Through this social role, it becomes clear how early training shaped the way knights presented themselves to the community. From this public image, one must next look at what happens when knights grow old or lose their ability to fight, a stage that reveals the clear limits of the knightly path. Over time, age and accumulated injuries left many knights no longer strong enough to meet the harsh demands of direct combat. Old wounds often resurfaced, causing chronic pain and limiting their ability to ride horses or wield heavy weapons. A knight who lost his fighting strength did not immediately lose his role, but was forced to shift to less dangerous duties. Many took on the task of training younger generations, passing down battlefield experience and military discipline. Others became involved in managing estates, overseeing tax collection, and maintaining order instead of fighting directly. However, not everyone possessed land or a position that guaranteed a stable life once they left the battlefield. Poor knights, or those who had fallen out of favor, could slip into hardship, dependent on the mercy of their lord. Honor, once built through battlefield achievements, gradually faded when they no longer appeared in conflicts. This transition often caused a psychological crisis as knights were accustomed to defining their worth through strength and victory. Some struggled to adapt, carrying bitterness and a sense of abandonment. Society celebrated knights when they were strong, but paid little attention once they grew weak. Old age exposed the fragility of the knightly path, where glory did not guarantee long-term security. Through these fates, it becomes clear that harsh training did not fully prepare knights for life after combat. The path of knighthood brought honor, but also carried the risk of loneliness in later years. From this personal decline, one must look toward how society began to reassess the knightly ideal, for it is here that the gap between ideal and reality gradually became impossible to ignore. In medieval society, the image of the knight did not exist only in real life, but was also powerfully constructed through legends, poetry, and stories told in great halls. These stories often glorified knights as symbols of courage, honor, and noble sacrifice. Heroic deeds were exaggerated, while failures were omitted, creating an almost perfect image of the knightly path. Storytelling culture helped society maintain shared ideals despite the brutal reality of war. Songs and epics were used to educate younger generations, encouraging them to emulate the ideal knight. Real knights, with their mistakes and wounds, rarely appeared in the stories passed down orally. This idealization obscured the darker side of harsh training and prolonged violence, yet it helped society rationalize the personal sacrifices required to uphold the feudal order. Knights became moral symbols, even though their real lives were full of contradictions. The gap between legend and reality placed pressure on many knights to live up to the image that had been created. Honor in stories often differed greatly from honor on the battlefield. Idealization also helped sustain the power and status of the warrior class in society. Through legend, knights were immortalized, rising above the limits of a human lifespan. These stories outlived the very knights who once wielded swords. This process of idealization has shaped how later generations view the Middle Ages. From these carefully polished images, it is necessary to close with an overall perspective on the path of knightly training, for only by placing ideal alongside reality can one fully understand the price paid from childhood onward. The path to becoming the knight in the Middle Ages did not begin on the battlefield, but in a childhood shaped by strict direction and uncompromising discipline. From the earliest years, a noble child was stripped of freedom and placed into a system of training designed to serve warfare and the feudal order. Each stage from page to squire gradually eliminated weakness, selecting only those capable of enduring hardship. Harsh physical training went hand in hand with moral conditioning, forcing future knights to learn obedience, loyalty, and the acceptance of violence as inevitable. Honor and knightly ideals were instilled early, becoming the measure of self-worth throughout a lifetime. Yet, behind these ideals lay physical injury, psychological pressure, and a constant fear of failure that never truly disappeared. As adults, knights carried the imprint of their training in every behavior, habit, and way they viewed the world. Even when age or wounds forced them from the battlefield, the influence of childhood training continued to shape their lives. Society celebrated knights as symbols, but rarely acknowledged the personal cost paid since early childhood. Knightly training produced loyal and effective warriors, but at the expense of childhood and personal choice. This path was not meant for everyone, only for those able to endure prolonged discipline and sacrifice. Seen as a whole, knights were forged not only by the sword, but by an entire life predetermined in advance. It was this early training that created the distinctive warrior class of the Middle Ages. And it was also this process that exposed the harsh nature of a society that placed war above the individual. Understanding this allows us to view knights not only through a lens of glory, but with empathy for the price they paid.